On November 1st, 2020, a group of scuba diving students plunged into the deep, icy waters of Lake McDonald in Glacier National Park, Montana. Led by instructors Debbie Snow and Seth Liston from the Gold Dive Center, the group was taking an advanced scuba course. It was advanced because each student already had a PADI open water license, which is the world's most famous entry-level diving certificate. That evening, the group was training for more specialist PADI qualifications. One of the students was 18-year-old Lana Mills. She'd been diving before, but never in such extreme conditions like these. The class was taking place after sunset. The water, fed by glacial runoff, was near freezing, and the lake that the group was diving in was at over 30,000 feet in altitude. It was also Linnеa's first time wearing a drysuit, the special gear designed to keep divers warm and dry in ice-cold water. And this drysuit would keep Linnea warm. Tragically, though, it wouldn't keep her alive. Her body would be dragged from the lake just hours later that evening. 5 minutes into the dive, Linnea began to struggle. She was uncomfortable and breathing harder. Her new drysuit was squeezing her torso more and more, making it difficult to catch her breath. At first, nobody in the group, no students or instructors, seemed to notice as Linnea stood perched on a small underwater ledge, frantically waving her arms for help. Eventually, it was another student, Bob Gentry, who spotted her in distress and swam over. Just as he did, however, in all of her panic, Linnea slipped from the ledge. She started sinking uncontrollably towards the bottom of the lake. After Bob had managed to catch up with Linnea, he desperately struggled to get her back to the surface. But Linnea's suit was squeezing so tight around her neck and chest that she couldn't breathe, and she just kept sinking and sinking into the darkness below, kicking her legs frantically to try and stay afloat. Eventually, Bob was being pulled down with her. He was going to die if he held on for any longer. The pressure was racking up too high. He gave up. He had to save himself and swim back to the surface. But the whole time, right from the beginning of the dive, Bob's GoPro had been recording everything. This meant that Linnea's final harrowing minutes underwater were captured on camera for all to see. In the footage, which we couldn't find the full version of, we only have pictures, Linnea's mouthpiece slips away. Panic floods her face as she gasps for air, only to find her lungs filling with water. And then, just before the camera cuts off, she reaches out her hand one last time before sinking into the blackness below. Within 5 minutes of entering the water, Linnea Mills had drowned. Less than an hour later, her lifeless body was pulled from the bottom of the lake, and in the lawsuit that followed, her instructors were grilled on just how responsible they were for the whole affair. Everything led to one question. Could Linnea's death have been entirely preventable? Linnea Mills loved the underwater world, and she dreamed of becoming a marine biologist. She volunteered on marine biology projects within the University of North Carolina, and she was quickly racking up dives that counted towards her PADI qualifications. It was all in the hope that one day she'd be certified enough to dive around the world and study marine life in all its stunning variety. PADI stands for the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. It's the largest and most respected dive organisation in the world. PADI sets global diving standards and safety protocols, and through thousands of dive centres around the world, it provides courses that certify divers all the way from beginners to instructors. Its entry-level certification, called Open Water, requires just 4 dives to complete. Once divers have this qualification, they can dive anywhere in the world up to a depth of 60 feet, as long as they have a buddy with them. They can also move on to more advanced PADI courses as they go. In July 2017, Linnea earned her Open Water certification in North Carolina. A year later, she dived again in Australia's Barrier Reef, and after that, she set her heights on the next qualification up the chain, the PADI Advanced Open Water. In October 2020, Linnea got in contact with the Gold Dive Center in her hometown of Missoula, Montana, and she was ready to take the course. Like thousands of dive shops around the world, Gold Dive operated under a license from PADI. In exchange for a fee, the centre was allowed to use the name and follow its training standards. All of this meant that when students completed a course at Gold Dive, under the supervision of a PADI instructor, they would earn an official PADI certification. So, just like that, with very few questions asked, Linnea was enrolled in the Advanced Open Water course. Her training date was set November 1st at Lake McDonald, the largest lake in Montana's Glacier National Park. By then, Linnea had logged just 5 dives in her life, and all of them had been in warm, shallow water. Diving in a deep, ice-cold, high-altitude lake would be a huge leap forward in difficulty. Because of that, the instructors at Gold Dive told Linnea, along with another student, Nathan Dudden, that they would need to wear dry suits on the day. Like Linnea, you might be wondering what a dry suit is. A dry suit is designed to keep scuba divers warm in freezing water. Unlike a wetsuit, which lets water seep in and then get warmed up by your natural body heat, a dry suit is completely sealed and must be worn with warm clothes underneath. Wetsuits work fine for warm dives, where the water is above 10 degrees Celsius or so, but in glacial lakes, not so much. By warming up the air inside the suit, not water, and giving space for warm clothes underneath, dry suits can protect divers from freezing temperatures. However, dry suits also come with risks that wetsuits don't. As a diver descends, the water pressure compresses the air trapped inside their suit. To avoid being squeezed, the diver has to add more air into the suit. On the way back up, the air inside their suit expands again, and it must be carefully released. Otherwise, the suit can act like a balloon, forcing the diver uncontrollably towards the surface. This is actually more dangerous than it might sound. Rising too quickly while scuba diving can cause nitrogen bubbles to form in the body. This is called decompression sickness, or the bends, and it can lead to joint pain, paralysis, or even death if not treated immediately. To control the air in a dry suit, divers use a special inflator valve connected to the air tank and an exhaust valve to release air on the way up. They also wear lead weights to counter the suit's buoyancy and stop themselves from floating up too fast. In short, this all means that dry suit diving needs special training. The hardest skill for any new diver is controlling their buoyancy, and this is even more difficult in a dry suit. PADI actually requires divers to complete a separate dry suit training before they're allowed to use one on another course. Linnea Mills, however, had never trained with a dry suit and had no experience wearing one. The instructors at Gold Dive, Seth Liston and Debbie Snow, knew this. What's more, they knew that PADI wouldn't let them rent Linnea a dry suit unless she had the right qualifications. The instructors didn't turn her away, though. Instead, they found a loophole. Snow and Liston put Linnea and her fellow student Nathan in contact with a local woman named Kendra Potter, who was selling 2 used dry suits. If the students bought the dry suits privately, the instructors thought, then Gold Dive could avoid renting out the dry suits directly and breaking any of PADI's rules. And so, at Snow and Liston's encouragement, Linnea and Nathan bought these suits from Kendra on October the 29th. For Linnea, this recommended purchase was the first nail in the coffin, because nobody noticed that her dry suit was missing a critical piece. It had no inflator hose. Without this, Linnea wouldn't be able to inflate her suit and control the pressure level inside, nor would she be able to control her buoyancy. But Kendra, who was selling the second-hand suit, didn't mention this. And of course, Linnea didn't notice either. She had no dry suit experience, after all. Disaster was going to strike sooner or later. Linnea was just excited to be finally taking the course. The day before the dive, she wrote in her diary, "I felt this exhilaration of energy, like everything is here. It's all here. We made it. Life begins here. Let's manifest more." On the morning of Sunday, November 1st, 2020, Debbie Snow picked Linnea up at her apartment and drove her to the Gold Dive Centre. From there, Linnea and several other students made the 3-hour, 145-mile drive to Lake McDonald in Glacier National Park. Red flags, for anyone experienced enough to notice them, quickly started to appear. The group was supposed to arrive at Lake McDonald by 2 p.m. to start diving, but they didn't actually make it there until 4 p.m. By then, the sun was already dropping behind the mountains. Two other students, Bob Gentry and a 14-year-old later identified as E.G., were already waiting by the lake. Both of them had started their PADI Drysuit diver course weeks earlier. But this was something else that Linnea didn't know. The advanced class she thought she was joining was actually a Drysuit course that was already underway. The instructors were essentially running two PADI courses at once. One was a Drysuit course for the other students, which, to make matters worse, Debbie Snow wasn't qualified to teach, and the other was Linnea's advanced open water course. Once at the shop, no one inspected Linnea's faulty Drysuit. It was just moments before actually entering the lake that Snow finally noticed Linnea's inflator hose was missing. But instead of cancelling the dive, Snow just told Linnea to rely on her buoyancy control device, or BCD. A BCD looks like a vest. Divers use their tank to fill the inner pockets of the BCD with air in order to stay buoyant and stop themselves from sinking underwater. But Linnea's Drysuit didn't have an inflator hose, so she couldn't fill her BCD with air. Thinking of a solution, Snow loaded up Linnea's BCD with 44 pounds of lead, zipping them into the pockets of her suit. This was far more weight than divers would normally use. To make things worse, Linnea wasn't giving a quick-release weight belt. This is standard equipment in diving, and it's designed to be dropped in an emergency so that divers can rise up towards the surface if they're sinking. All in all, the suit that Snow had crafted for Linnea was a death trap, and it would soon prove how. The dive eventually started around 5 p.m, just 20 minutes before sunset, and the scene on the beach was disorganized and chaotic. The instructors didn't give the students any dive objectives or conduct a safety briefing. They didn't check anyone's equipment, and they didn't do any practice runs on land. They just jumped straight into the icy lake water. It wasn't long after entering the water that one student, 14-year-old E.G., backed out of the dive entirely. She was cold, scared, and struggling with her gear. She couldn't get her buoyancy right, she was having trouble clearing her ears, and she kept signalling distress. As a result, Snow brought her back to the surface and resumed the dive with other students. The instructors led the other students deeper into the lake to around 59 feet, and it was here, somehow, that everybody stopped noticing what was happening to Linnea. Her Drysuit was still uninflated at that depth, and the increasing pressure was squeezing her chest and limbs, crushing the suit tight against her body. It became harder for her to breathe or even move her arms and legs. At high altitude, like Lake McDonald, the air pressure at the surface is lower than at sea level. This means that as you dive, the pressure builds faster, so your body feels more squeeze, even at shallower depths. At that depth, the pressure on Linnea's body had doubled compared to the surface, at about 25 pounds per square inch. As her symptoms got worse, Linnea stood herself up on a narrow underwater ledge and started signalling for help. Nobody responded. Instructor Snow swam directly over her, close enough to see her struggle, but didn't stop. Seth Liston and another diver were within arm's reach, but even as Linnea waved at them, no one offered to help. We know all of this because another student, Bob Gentry, was recording the whole dive with his GoPro. This would turn out to be invaluable for investigators, especially in disproving the statements later given by the instructors to police. Eventually, Linnea signalled to Bob for help, but in the chaos of trying to get his attention, she lost her footing on the ledge. She slipped backwards into the black water, tumbling down the steep underwater wall. Bob immediately gave chase. He caught up with Linnea at 85 feet, where the pressure was nearly 3 times greater than at the surface. The crushing force of the Drysuit was suffocating Linnea, and her strength was fading fast. For the next 90 seconds, Bob fought to save Linnea's life. He reached for her quick-release weight belt, the fastest way to help her float upwards, but again, there was none. She hadn't been issued it. Instead, Linnea's 44 pounds of lead had been zipped into her BCD and Drysuit pockets. They were hidden, and Bob had no idea where the weight was stored. The two dive students sank together to a depth of 105 feet, where the pressure reached 45 psi. Linnea's body was squeezed even tighter, and the cold water stole what little energy she had left. Eventually, she lost consciousness and her mouthpiece slipped out. Linnea's lungs were drawing in icy lake water. Bob tried to give her his spare air supply, then attempted to haul Linnea up towards the surface by sheer force. But nothing worked. And all the while, nobody came to help. There were no instructors in sight, no movement above, and no searching torchlights. With his own air running out, Bob had no choice. He let go of Linnea and made a desperate, uncontrolled ascent, rocketing from 105 feet of depth to the surface of the water in under a minute. This was much faster than the maximum safe rate, and he was risking serious decompression sickness. At first, no one was there on the surface of the lake. When Snow finally came up, she had no idea that anything had happened until Bob told her Linnea had drowned. Snow made a brief attempt to dive for Linnea but failed. On a second try, this time with Liston beside her, they finally found Linnea's body at 127 feet. Even then, Liston left Snow to handle the recovery on her own. She was forced to strip away Linnea's BCD, heavy with lead, before she could bring her to the surface. And then came something almost unthinkable. Snow told 14-year-old E.G., the student who had backed out the dive earlier, to wade back into the freezing lake and help her drag Linnea's corpse onto the bank. Back on shore, it was chaos. The gold dive instructors had no emergency plan and no way to communicate in the wilderness at night. There were no qualified support staff, no emergency protocols, no surface support. The nearest hospital was 35 miles away, and the closest phone service 11 miles away. In the end, it was a passing couple from Florida who luckily came across the scene and drove out of Glacier National Park to get help. That evening, Linnea's mother, Lisa, received the call no parent ever wants. She later told the press, "The sheriff called us, and they wouldn't tell us what was wrong, but they said they had to come to our house, and that's when I knew. They don't come to our house unless someone has died, so I told my husband that Linnea died, and we need to prepare ourselves." In the end, it became clear. Linnea Mills was crushed to death by her own drysuit. She didn't have an inflator hose to add air into the suit, which meant that as she sank deeper, the pressure only increased, squeezing her body tighter and tighter. From the very start, she had no control over her buoyancy and no way to stop herself from sinking deeper into the lake. And without a quick-release weight belt, Bob Gentry had no chance of saving her. The 44 pounds of lead had been zipped into her suit pockets by instructor Debbie Snow, making them impossible to ditch in an emergency. In May 2021, Linnea's and Bob's parents filed a $12 million civil lawsuit against Gold Dive owners David and Janine Olson, instructors Debbie Snow and Seth Liston, and Paddy. David Concannon, the attorney representing Linnea's family, argued that the instructors were unqualified, failed to follow Paddy's safety standards, and were negligent before, during, and after the dive. After all, based on the information Linnea gave them in October, it should have been clear that she had very little scuba experience. She'd never dived in cold water or at high altitude, she had no deep diving experience, and she'd never used a dry suit. But then again, her instructors didn't have much experience either. Investigations later revealed that Debbie Snow had earned her PADI instructor certificate in the warm waters of Key Largo in Florida, just a year before Linnea died. She never got the altitude diver, ice diver, or dry suit diver certifications, all essential for diving in Montana's Glacier National Park. Her assistant, meanwhile, 22-year-old Seth Liston, only had a junior open water certification. This is an entry-level course for kids aged 10 to 14, which requires just 4 dives to a maximum depth of 60 feet. Gold Dive also lacked a commercial use authorization from the National Park Service. If they had one, they'd have known the park was closed and emergency services weren't available around Lake McDonald, and the key planning information for safe dives was missing. It wasn't even Gold Dive's first brush with death. In July 2020, Ellen Hubble sued Gold Dive for renting scuba equipment to her husband, Jesse Hubble, who drowned in Canyon Ferry a year before. Jesse hadn't dived in more than 25 years and wasn't certified, but the dive shop rented him the gear anyway, and his regulator was apparently on backwards. There was still a lawsuit hanging over this by the time Linnea arrived on the scene. Snow and Liston didn't tell Linnea any of this, of course. Instead, they led her into an ice-cold lake with no safety checks, no support in the water, and no emergency emergency backup in case of an emergency. They let her dive with a faulty drysuit that they'd crudely modified on a course they weren't qualified to teach, and completely failed to notice that she was in trouble under their care in the water. Attorney Concannon concluded that it was a disaster from start to finish. He even claimed that the general staff at Goldive employees tried to cover up their role in Linnea's death. Concannon said that Linnea's dive computer was still on her wrist when her body was brought ashore, but that Snow removed it before the medics arrived and took it home. He also said that when investigators later went to Snow's home to interview her, she showed them the dive computer and claimed the data wasn't downloadable. It stayed in her home for over a year and a half longer before it was actually finally used as evidence. What's more, Janine Olsen, one of the owners of Goldive, also supposedly told the coroner that Linnea was witnessed by a dive buddy to panic, then fall passively to the bottom of a lake after swimming without difficulty at a depth of approximately 40 feet. And this was, of course, false. Linnea had been struggling, desperately signalling for help as the drysuit crushed her and the cold water sapped her strength. Either way, Bob's GoPro captured much of what happened, and his footage contradicted this statement. Paddy, meanwhile, was accused by the lawsuit of failing to properly oversee its member dive businesses. In response, Paddy argued that Goldive and its staff were neither its agents nor employees, and that Linnea signed a waiver so the organisation could not be held responsible. In the end, an undisclosed settlement was reached in February 2023. Debbie Snow had her Paddy licence revoked that same year, and the Olsens had already shut down Goldive Centre in 2022. In the end, nobody was criminally charged. The US Attorney's Office decided not to press charges against Debbie Snow, the main target of the lawsuit, as criminal responsibility couldn't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Linnea's family responded to this with outrage, stating, "As it stands now, Deb Snow will not be charged with so much as a parking violation for causing the death of our daughter. This is not justice." Paddy wasn't held responsible either. The court ruled that dive shops and instructors aren't actually Paddy's agents. Its members run their businesses independently, and so the worldwide organisation couldn't be blamed for Goldive's mistakes. So the question still remains today. With the instructors of Goldive and Paddy itself acquitted, who really is to blame for the death of Linnea Mills?